Father Rogelio, the priest of the church, was troubled by a question on a certain day. Day by day, the offerings box contained less and less money. The nuns shrugged their shoulders, as none of them, women living the church life, would have any use for it. But then where could the money be disappearing to? Father couldn't suspect the parishioners, as he had known these people for many years. He had married many of them, baptized their children. There were families for whom he was an old friend. The very thought of such misconduct on their part seemed absurd not only to the priest. Father Rogelio, just think of Alicia, Sister Maria, an elderly and wise nun, said to him one day. Do you remember that little pink child who grabbed onto your collar in fear and wouldn't let go? You've seen her grow, and now she comes to you for service, pregnant and happy, promising to bring her child to you. The man closed his eyes and smiled faintly. Back then, he was still young, only recently permitted to conduct ceremonies. Alicia's mother was very worried back then, as the girl was very restless and sensitive. The little girl got scared when she was handed over to a stranger, scrunching up her little pink face and grabbing onto the priest with all her might. He still remembers the flushed face of the young mother, Alicia's tiny hands, and the laughter of the parishioners. No, these people would never stoop to theft. I remember. Time flew by so fast that at first I was scared when the young lady told me about such a joyful event, he chuckled. I truly thought she was still just a little girl. And she's already 24, all grown up now. And all the people coming here to pray are just like her. You've led them on the path of faith for many years. Our modest church is important to them. We are their friends, teachers, and part of their families. Sister Maria always brought the priest back from the path of doubts and suspicions. When he first took on the role of the priest, it was this woman who helped him cope with his anxieties. Maria was always there to give him advice and support. Rogelio was the eldest child in his family, but she was still the older sister in his life. But even she was puzzled now. Both the church and the Sunday school and the shelter all depended on donations. While the stolen amounts might not have been significant, they were disappearing regularly. So, much to Father's regret, someone close must have been peeking into the box. And now Sister Maria's words didn't bring the man the peace he needed. Feeling terrible pangs of conscience, he decided to follow his suspicions and began to observe. It pained him to think that someone among these dear-hearted people could be a thief. And as he glanced at the box during the service, he felt a terrible anxiety. He still hoped that the decrease in money was simply due to people losing interest in faith. But that wasn't the case. What is this? Could it be? A thunderclap of a question raced through the man's mind when he saw the boy. People dispersed to their seats, waiting for the prayer reading to begin. Meanwhile, the slender boy circled around the box, cautiously glancing around. The child wore a hood, but Father Rogelio could still feel his gaze on him, which the boy kept throwing his way. So the man decided to pretend he was busy searching for the right page in the prayer book. His heart ached with the sense of impending trouble. Trouble, that's exactly what he could call witnessing a theft. And nothing else. The boy crept closer to the box for a long time. And then, making sure everyone was engaged in the service, he opened it slightly, took out a few bills, and headed for the exit. That's when the man, outraged and saddened, decided to act. "Young man," he shouted, his voice barely concealing his excitement. "Wait, young man, where are you going? Stay with us, we're just about to begin." The boy felt like he was hit with boiling water. He spun around sharply and stood rooted to the spot. He didn't know what to do, whether to run or to stay. However, after standing for a minute, shifting from foot to foot, he timidly walked over to the benches and sat down. Looking around, he noticed the parishioners bowing their heads, and he followed suit. Amidst all this serene calmness, it was hard to believe that a highly important matter was being decided right now. Father Rogelio exhaled. Perhaps today the theft problem would find its solution. But until then, he would have to pretend as if nothing had happened. The service went on peacefully, though an unfamiliar hooded boy fidgeted in his seat as if not used to sitting still for so long without any activity. In reality, he felt the man's gaze on him keenly the whole time. It oppressed him, much like the images of the saints silently reproaching him. And then, people began to slowly rise from their seats. The youth hastened to do the same and leave the church as quickly as possible. Father Rogelio watched the back of the young thief. He had to maneuver through the crowd, muttering brief "excuse me"s and pressing forward. Keeping track of the boy became increasingly difficult. He worried that the boy would manage to disappear. Finally reaching the end of the crowd, he didn't see the gray hood. A sense of frustration hit him like a sledgehammer. All this time, he had held on to the hope of putting an end to the mischief once and for all, but no. The boy had obviously escaped. Shoving the negative emotions as deep down as he could, Rogelio was about to return to the altar when he noticed a sleeve of a gray hoodie flickering among the crowd. Unable to think of anything better, the man seized the skinny wrist and pulled it towards him. It all happened so quickly that no one noticed this rough movement. No one except the priest and the thief. Rogelio tightened his grip on the boy's hand, who was attempting to break free, and led him towards the confessional, where there were no people and it was quiet. Only here did he release the boy and look at him sternly, yet compassionately. Like a loving father looking at his erring son. "Well, my son, I'm waiting for explanations," the padre spoke as quietly as possible, still afraid to attract the attention of the parishioners. "What drove you to such a low deed?" The boy remained silent. He stood, head bowed, staring at his feet and nervously fidgeting with his fingers. His shoulders were trembling visibly. The child was greatly frightened and didn't know what to say. In such silence, the two stood for a couple of long minutes, and Father Rogelio made another attempt to resolve the matter amicably. He reached out his broad hand towards the boy's head and began to pull off his hood. To his surprise, the child quickly grabbed his headgear and even began to push the priest's hand away. However, he didn't relent. With a swift motion, he pulled the hood a little harder, revealing the thief's face before him, and suddenly felt his heart breaking into tiny pieces. "Paquito? Paquito, my boy, is that really you?" exclaimed the padre in disbelief, but instantly recoiled. "How could you?" Before the priest stood a former ward of the orphanage, red-faced from tears and shame. Paquito had always been a sweet and obedient boy. Such children are said to have a golden character, polite, kind, and with a lively mind. If Rogelio had ever harbored ill thoughts about his charges, this boy wouldn't even be on the list of those capable of such treachery. Simply because he would be beyond suspicion, in the eyes of the padre, children like him possessed minds too pure. "Father Rogelio, I didn't mean to," the boy's voice trembled intensely. I just. And then he couldn't hold it in any longer, breaking into tears on the spot. He continued to mumble typical excuses a child could make, all the while choking back tears and wiping his face with his sleeve. The man felt pity for him, his gaze now full of sympathy. After brief contemplation, he placed a hand on the boy's back and led him away from the church. Before asking about motives, it was necessary to calm the youth. They headed towards the shelter from which little Paquito had recently been taken into a new family. The children playing outside suddenly fell silent upon seeing their old friend. Each of them exchanged glances, as their companion seemed in such a despondent state that fear crept in. Had he been returned to the shelter? But Father Rogelio reassured them with a gentle gesture and a silent nod, as if to say that it concerned only the two of them. The children returned to their game, albeit with less enthusiasm. Inside the shelter, it was much quieter. The padre led the culprit into the first empty office, immediately closing the door behind them. He didn't want such an unpleasant conversation to reach anyone else's ears. Exposing Paquito's misdeeds seemed inappropriate, especially since he was already deeply troubled by his own wrongdoing. One shouldn't add unnecessary stress to the child. At first, they sat in silence, only broken by the boy's quiet sobs and Rogelio's heavy sighs. But sitting in silence indefinitely was not an option. Answers were needed. "My boy, what are you doing?" The priest slowly spoke with deep disappointment in his voice. "We raised you, nurtured you, tried to give you the best we could. Why? Why do you need these handouts? You have found a new family, and as far as I know, these people live in plenty." The boy, who had somewhat calmed down, suddenly burst into tears again. He leaped from his chair and rushed into the arms of the church's pastor. This poor child clung to his caregiver as tightly as he could. His voice was full of pain and profound resentment, his whole body shaking with uncontrollable sobs. Father Rogelio stroked the boy's head and whispered warm words, trying to comfort the poor soul. He believed that this young man would never stoop to such lows without a reason. "Paquito, please, tell me, what is troubling you?" "She's bad," the boy cried out through tears. "She always bullies me." The man tried to remember the family who took in this wonderful young man. A sturdy man with a firm handshake inspired confidence in the well-being of the family. Such men know how to provide for their loved ones with everything necessary. Though he behaved reservedly towards the boy, it was evident from his eyes that his heart melted from the positivity that always emanated from Paquito. Standing beside him was his wife, a slender brunette, slightly younger than her husband. She fluttered around the boy, always trying to bring him treats with every visit. This woman appeared friendly and caring. But now, as the boy suddenly began to speak such dreadful things, Father Rogelio couldn't determine whether his impression of this couple was accurate. "Wait, but who is mistreating you? How could that lead you to stealing?" The boy recoiled from the priest and clumsily wiped his cheek with his already damp sleeve. "Irene is bad. Only when Roberto goes away on business, she turns into a demon." The boy grimaced in disgust. "She takes all the money that Papa Roberto gives me for school lunches. Mama says I'm a brat, that if I want money, I should earn it myself." Father Rogelio's eyes widened in shock. "Paquito, are you honest with me?" Yes, Father Rogelio, I'm telling the truth. She's sweet and caring only when Roberto comes home. Irene even hits me if I ask for money to eat again. Sometimes she punishes me and leaves me without dinner, but it's not my fault." Paquito sniffled, paused for a few seconds, gathering his thoughts, and continued, "I understand I'm still too young to do all the chores she asks of me. I can't take out heavy bags of garbage on my own. I can't wash those tall windows to the ceiling. It's hard for me to do housework alone, and it gets easier only when Roberto comes. Otherwise, I would really struggle. Forgive me, Father Rogelio, but I couldn't think of anything better than to steal a little money from the alms box. I know I'm doing very wrong, but I never took more than I needed. Never. It's just when Irene sees me with extra money, she takes it away, and then I have to go back and take more. I don't know why she's like that, honestly. But I'm very scared to tell Roberto about it. Once I told him she mistreated me, and he didn't believe me. After that, when he went away on business again, Irene tied me to the charger cord, and I didn't eat for 2 days. I don't talk to Roberto about his mean wife anymore. Please forgive me." Rogelio placed his hand over his chest. He felt sickened by what he had heard. His protégé, his dear boy, was being tormented in his new family, and he, the old fool, hadn't even bothered to visit them once and check on their welfare. They sat in the office, silent for a long time, occasionally glancing at each other. "Father Rogelio, don't you believe me either?" The boy suddenly asked so sorrowfully that it instantly broke the priest's heart. "No, my son, I absolutely believe you. I just don't understand where the teachers are looking. If your new mother resorts to violence, they should have noticed something at least. At first, I went to school like everyone else, and I even made some friends. But then Irene told Roberto that teachers were complaining about my behavior, that I was an uncontrollable child and needed individual attention. So, they switched me to homeschooling. But Roberto doesn't know about this." Father sighed heavily. The boy definitely needed saving, he just didn't know how to do it. Should he call the authorities? But what guarantees were there that this cunning woman wouldn't wriggle out of it again? He could talk to Roberto himself, but then poor Paco's fate would be in danger, as it's hard to simply believe the words of a priest who first placed a child in a family and now wants to return him to an orphanage. On the other hand, Irene, realizing that the boy had reported her to someone, could become terribly embittered towards her foster son. It required some cunning here. But first and foremost, they needed to take care of the boy, who had clearly lost weight in his 2 years with the new family. Father Rogelio instructed the nannies to feed the boy separately from the other children and not to ask unnecessary questions. If the other wards heard their friend's story, none of them would want to live in a foster family. Paco's case was undoubtedly terrible, but other children, boys and girls, had every chance of finding their happiness outside the walls of the shelter. Especially since now he wouldn't allow such a terrible mistake and would thoroughly vet the families to whom they entrusted defenseless children. The boy devoured the modest meal with animal greediness. It was terrifying to imagine how one could starve a child to death, being wealthy people. After seeing off the boy, Rogelio immediately went to seek advice from Sister Maria. The man couldn't leave everything as it was, but he also didn't know what he could do in such a situation. As the priest recounted Paco's story, the woman's face became increasingly pale. In all her years as a nun, she had never encountered cruelty in the foster families of her charges. But Rogelio wouldn't have turned to her just to share his worries with someone if he wasn't absolutely sure that she could find a way out of the situation. After finishing the story, he began to share his assumptions with her. "Keep an eye on her," she suddenly interrupted him. "Take your phone with you, gather evidence. We need to prove to Roberto that his wife is by no means as kind and harmless as he thinks." "Perhaps you're right." This time she managed to instill confidence in the priest. The next day he dressed in ordinary, unremarkable clothes and went to the address indicated in the adoption documents. As he approached, the full beauty of the wealthy neighborhood unfolded before the priest. And how sad it was to realize that behind such a diligent facade could hide the very real dirt. Rogelio checked the address and stood a little away from the right house. He stood there for about an hour when the gate of the high fence began to open. Tearful Paco emerged from behind the fence. Father immediately waved to him, beckoning him over. "What are you doing here?" the boy asked in amazement. "Nothing special. Take this, my boy." The man pulled a couple of small bills from his pocket and handed them to the child. "Go grab a bite. Today you can go to church without stealing anymore. From now on, come to the shelter to eat." The boy didn't utter a word. He simply smiled warmly and hugged the priest. After bidding farewell, the visibly cheered up Paquito soon disappeared around the nearest corner. Apparently, he had been punished again today. Father Rogelio, however, remained in his place. After some time, an expensive car approached the gates. A beautiful young woman with short hair stepped out, but she wasn't Paquito's mother. This stranger was slightly shorter and dressed less extravagantly. She rang the doorbell, and soon Irene appeared in the gate's opening. It was clear that these women had known each other for a long time. The priest decided to approach a little closer. Luckily, there were enough decorative bushes around to act unnoticed. He even managed to find such a good spot that he could distinguish every word of the women from there. "Isabella, I asked you not to bring anything for this boy," Irene said loudly to Isabella with undisguised irritation. "There's no need to spoil him. Why are you so angry with him? He seems like such a kind and calm child," Isabella mused, not hurrying to put the bag back into the car. "It's hard for me to imagine what the boy could have done to make you hate him so much." Irene rolled her eyes theatrically, and Rogelio, holding his breath, turned on the recorder on his phone. This conversation turned out to be very interesting from the first seconds. The homeowner approached her friend closer and hissed angrily. "Do you remember what happened with Lucia?" She stared her friend straight in the eyes, anger boiling in hers. "She got pregnant by my Roberto back then, and then left her brat on the church doorstep. And Roberto had to pick that one out of all the pretty children in the shelter, the one that now gets on my nerves all the time. This scoundrel even looks like his mother. I'm afraid my idiot might notice that." "How do you know all this?" "Well, you can't help but turn into a spy when you're trying to hold onto a man like that," Irene said proudly. "If Roberto wasn't himself, I would never forgive him for cheating. but now he brought the fruit of his pleasures into our house. I look at him and see the day when I was tearing my hair out because of Roberto. I won't tolerate this little one. Can't stand him. But it's better to let Roberto play father to this grown-up child. I take my pills just as I always have. And he still believes I'm barren. Yeah, right. I'm not going to ruin my figure and then deal with a child. The words of this woman shook Rogelio so much that he was ready to forget all church commandments, come out of his hiding place, and tell her to her face what he thought of her. But he held back. For Paquito's sake. Isabella said a couple more condemning words to her friend. Irene let them pass by, and both women disappeared into the house. The priest turned off the recorder and squatted down, leaning his back against the fence. So much cruelty towards a child because of adults' mistakes. He couldn't believe that a person could be so hypocritical. Of course, cheating is terrible, but it doesn't compare to tormenting a child, a living being. Taking a deep breath, he stood up and decided to hurry back to the church to consult with Sister Maria again. Listening to the recording, Sister Maria shook her head. Tears glistened in her eyes. This whole story seemed to her like a reckless circle of pain, where all the blows fell on the poor boy. The cold coffee wouldn't go down her throat anymore, no matter how hard she tried to wash down that prickly lump stuck somewhere in her throat. Call Roberto, let him come to us immediately after his business trip. Let him come alone, without his wife. She sighed bitterly, crossed herself, and added, God forgive me, but I don't want to see that woman in a holy place. Rogelio silently nodded. While waiting for Roberto, all the participants of this peculiar investigation were on pins and needles. What if he didn't care about what Irene was doing in his absence? What if her conversation recordings with Isabella wouldn't be sufficient? In any case, even if Roberto did nothing, the police would always be able to take over the case. The long-awaited day arrived when, as it turned out, the boy's biological father had promised to come. Rogelio and Maria didn't leave the office. They sat there in painful anticipation, filled with the strongest anxiety. And then, there was a knock on the door. A man in a business suit entered the office. He looked tired and irritated because Rogelio had decided not to disclose such serious statements over the phone. So it happened that the businessman had no clue why he was urgently summoned to the shelter. Hello, Father Rogelio, Sister Maria. Roberto walked in and took a seat in front of them. Let's get straight to the point. I'm very tired from the journey. Father cleared his throat and pushed the phone closer to the man. He exchanged glances with Maria and gave her the floor. You see, Mr. Velasquez, we are very concerned about the well-being of our wards and wish them only good. She nervously adjusted her habit before continuing, but in our case, we simply had to summon you. There was a minor incident with Paquito, which raises doubts about his happy life within the walls of your home. I'm listening. Roberto's voice was firm and sharp. He noticeably tensed upon hearing that the matter concerned his adopted son. Instead of continuing empty dialogue, Father Rogelio simply played the recording, allowing the man to learn everything he needed to know about the situation. Towards the end of the recording, it was evident how Roberto clenched his jaws with force and how his gaze acquired an unhealthy spark. Did you know about this, Mr. Velasquez? There's not a single piece of news here that I haven't heard before. Do you really? Do you entertain the possibility that Paquito might be your biological son? The man sprang from his chair. Only now did the mask of cold confidence slip from him. He was both puzzled and enraged at the same time. Yes, I cheated on her 10 years ago. And even then it wasn't clear to me whether it counted as cheating, because at that time we were in the process of divorcing for a completely different reason. As you can see, we managed to save our marriage. And Lucia, the man lowered his tone, evidently plunging into unpleasant memories. Lucia left. As soon as she found out that I wasn't officially single back then, she left. She didn't destroy our family with Irene. Everything was falling apart before her. But Irene convinced herself that during those unfortunate 6 months, I still belonged to her. I couldn't imagine she could unleash all her anger on that poor boy. Do you know what she did to him? Without delving into details to avoid further distressing the man, Rogelio relayed Paquito's words to him. Roberto closed his eyes as if refusing to believe what was said. But recalling the recording provided by Isabella of her conversation with Irene, he was forced to accept this cruel truth. Irene tormented the son of her rival. However, at the same time, she tormented her husband's own son. The man dreamed of having a child, and that's why they came to this shelter. Only now did Roberto understand why this big-eyed boy had captured him. His expressive eyes and cute freckles reminded him of the woman who had simply swept him off his feet 10 years ago. If Lucia had stayed then, they would have raised Paquito together. He wouldn't have been abandoned at the church, he wouldn't have ended up in the shelter, and he wouldn't be experiencing all this pain and hurt now. But Roberto was the only one to blame. He should have explained himself to her before starting the affair. Now it was too late to dwell on the past. He couldn't influence it anymore, but he could at least try to redeem his guilt before his son. A month later, Rogelio conducted the service. Donations had stopped disappearing, but there was still no news from Paquito or Roberto. The man promised that everything would soon be sorted out, and the priest decided to patiently wait. Suddenly, looking towards the back rows, he saw them. They were sitting here, in this hall, listening to the prayer he was reading. After the service, Father Rogelio approached them, not hiding his surprise or pleasant excitement. Paquito now looked healthier and happier compared to the last time they saw each other. Padre looked at Roberto, waiting for him to speak. Irene is out of the picture now. I filed for divorce. Furthermore, I've gone to the police to make sure she gets what she deserves. He gently embraced the boy's shoulder. I've made plenty of mistakes. But Paquito, despite all the pain he endured, gave me a chance to make things right. Father Rogelio, it's so great with Dad now. I'm back in school. He even lets me bring friends over. A young woman with short chestnut hair approached them quietly. The boy immediately hugged her, while Father Rogelio tried to remember where he had seen her. Hello. I'm so ashamed I wasn't among the first to raise alarm. She stroked the boy's head, pouring into the gesture all the tenderness any woman could muster. I visited Irene so many times, but somehow I never noticed how hard it was for Paquito. I thought about talking to Roberto about Irene's angry outbursts, but you beat me to it. Thank you, because it's quite possible that without you, this matter would have dragged on much longer. It was Isabella herself who, it seemed, tried to spoil her friend's adopted son, even though she forbade it. As she said all this, she looked terribly guilty, but her words sounded sincere. Rogelio only smiled gently. My children, don't dwell on past mistakes. Ahead of you lies a whole sea of ways to make things right. Be happy.